Hello, good morning. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. A reminder of our top stories here this morning. The Chancellor has said he's confident in the government's plan to halve inflation as MPs return to Westminster this week. The Education Secretary has said disturbance at children's learning caused by unsafe concrete should last days, not weeks. And the government's plan to rescue steelmaking in South Wales has been described as a missed opportunity to create a more decarbonised industry. So time now to take you through the Sunday papers. Here with me to review them this morning are the entrepreneur Kate Hardcastle and the anthropologist Marianne Hotter. So very good morning to you. Lovely to see you both here. Different stories on the front of the papers, but there's one that dominates, and that's the fallout from this issue of aerated concrete, RAAC, particularly in schools. Marianne, kick us off with the Observer's take on this morning.
So the Observer are leading with this story about a whistleblower from the civil service, a senior civil servant, who's talked to the Observer and said basically that the Tories for many years now have been dangerously complacent about this, and that Nadine Zahawi, who was the education minister at the time, had a number of very serious reports crossing his desk, but the advice, the instruction was to basically do nothing, ignore it, hope for the best, kick the can down the road. So the source was in the private office of Nadine Zahawi, who was the education secretary at the time. The thing that's all coming out of this is that obviously this has been known for a long time. Even when these buildings were built with this particular type of material, they knew that there was a shelf life to them, and the shelf life has expired. I think the one thing that I can take heart from, I guess, is that this whole expose, this horrible kind of horrifying revelation, isn't off the back of a terrible tragedy where a school has collapsed on classrooms full of children and teachers.
Because there was a collapse at one in 2018, but there were no children or teachers present. It was the weekend, I think.
Exactly. Now, the big questions are not only how complacent were ministers, how complacent were people at local authorities who had the expertise to know that this was an enormous issue and of life or death magnitude, but what kind of institutional failings are there? And then what other skeletons are there in the cupboard? What other materials we regularly used in the 50s and 60s in those housing booms that are just ticking time bombs? I mean, we know certainly, I think Kate's going to cover some of the other materials that were used.
Well, yes, well, should we go straight on to that then? Because
but it's not just schools, it's hospitals, it's
that's right, there are questions over
leisure centres.
Yeah, how many public buildings are potentially involved?
Yeah.
And talking of other materials, the Sunday Times cover some of that, don't they?
Well, they talk about a campaign. They've got this sub-headline, Act Now on Asbestos, and they're talking about the fact that they want to see a phased reaction towards this now to be able to ensure that without collapsing any entity or any one organisation, that these buildings are looked into. But the feature also goes on to the fact that the problem was first highlighted in 1999. And I think it's so important to, whilst yes, of course, there's not been any catastrophic event, just to raise a huge red flag here and say that these types of issues need phase control. To keep going, they need absolutely to ensure that there's some system of organised checks and balances, like an MOT on a car. Why has this not been done in some building surveys? Why is this not being kept up to date? Where are the 2, 3, 4 year checks? I mean,
well, here's the thing. I mean, from the material that's being leaked to whistleblowers who are speaking out now, it becomes clear that the checks are being done. The information was there, but it's a political will to not spend public money on crumbling public buildings.
And I guess that the politicians will be questioned about that, and it'll be interesting to see what Nadine Zahawi comes back and says as well about that whistleblower. I guess the question is how much was known, as you say, and what they would say about restraints on spending for other reasons, maybe whether it's COVID, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it was the fallout from the financial crisis. You don't know what the explanations were for trying to keep costs down. And I also just wanted to explain with the Sunday Times, the asbestos link, is the sense that because you've got this type of concrete that is liable to crumble, it could expose asbestos, which is seen to be safer if it's stable, but if there's instability, then it's really dangerous. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's this mix of materials, it's the exposure element, but this is a conversation that almost seems as if it's been proactive. Let's act now on asbestos. Let's make sure this doesn't go any further. Absolutely needs to be done, but why has it got to this stage? And even with the checks in place, why hasn't there been the clarity to be able to spend? Because think about this simply. You have a huge problem that magnifies and everything's left to the last minute. Costs are absolutely huge. If you deal with things bit by bit in a staged, phased approach, guess what? It's a rolling cost that's much easier to manage. And that's the question right now. Of course, we had other issues like COVID, but why wasn't that phased approach taken to help keep the budget in some kind of systematic available amount?
Yeah, and Labour calling for lots of answers.
Yeah,
and
we need them.
wanting a full audit of the number of buildings that are likely to be affected, with parents concerned about their children's education being disrupted.
I think that's the other thing, that this comes to light in the last week of the summer holidays, given that it's been known about since, let's say, 2018, let's say 2022 if we're being kind. Why wait until a week before the school summer holidays are finished for teachers to scramble?
They
for
say there
parents
was more information at the last minute that suggested it was more dangerous than they'd realised, don't they?
Just never feels like a last-minute information piece, does it? It's not something like a weather event or something that is changeable. It's a building, it's there, it's present, and there will be a lot of experts who know a lot about this.
I feel like someone had a conversation with an expert and they said, no, mate, you would go to prison because you would be liable for the deaths of 300 children. There would be no coming. It would be, I honestly believe, and they said, oh, wait, really, that bad? Oh, and I would be personally like, oh, I probably should do something about it then, shouldn't I?
Yeah.
And calls were made. I have no faith that the system worked. It's just that we've been lucky.
Okay, so there'll be lots of column inches in the papers and on broadcast media as well, obviously, of this story this week. As we understand, I think teams of structural engineers are going in now to schools to try and check out whether or not they're dangerous.
And a lot of fear of parents as well, to try to get their head around yet another issue.
Yeah, exactly. And possibly remote learning. Yeah, exactly.
You say, this classroom's okay, this one's going to collapse, but don't worry, we'll put your kids in the one next to the bit with the asbestos and the crumbly concrete.
This is it. This is it.
Terrifying.
Yeah, let's move on to cover. The Mail on Sunday has a very different story about body cameras on staff in Tesco's.
I mean, it really does feel to be a watershed moment when we're talking about one of our biggest grocery stores still in terms of size, saying we're going to offer all of our team members on our front line, which, for me, they're colleagues on the store floor, the most important part of a retail environment when it comes to physical retail, offering them body cameras because the rising rates of violence towards them, and talks about 200 staff members a month at Tesco have been involved in what their class as a serious challenge, violence, altercation. I mean, this goes into years of figures since 2020, where we understand that shoplifting went up significantly. We understand there was a lot of pressure. COVID particularly put an emotional impact on a lot of people. But if you think about it, retail's one of the only places where people can interact with another human being. A lot of services have been removed, like high street banks, etc. These moments in our social humanity, these interactions, retail workers are having to face into problems from people that are almost mounted from everything in their life. And that interaction on a complaint or an issue or a queue at a service till suddenly then becomes the biggest issue in their life. Retail workers don't always have the training, the support that they need to be able to interact and engage in a way that's going to help them to perhaps counterbalance it, but sometimes you just can't be helped. So we've got retail workers challenged every day, day in, day out, with violence and threats towards them, and our biggest retailer, Tesco, is having to say, look, we're going to have have to tackle this by putting body cameras on our workforce if they want it.
Quick thought on this, Marianne. It's quite shocking, isn't it?
It is really shocking, but I feel like putting a body camera on a staff member is, the horse has bolted out of the stable. We need to be preventing those interactions so that staff members are safe at work, so that we all live in a coherent social society, rather than capturing the evidence of the assault on camera.
Yeah.
We need to be stopping it in the first place, stopping it from people escalating to that level of
which is a whole bigger issue, isn't it? Trying to work out how to do that. Marianne and Kate, good to see you. You'll be back in the next hour, but we're out of time for that. Thanks very much indeed.